still use carbon paper.
It's exactly 6 p.m. So we can start with the pledge. If we could, I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We're going to start off tonight with welcoming Michael Clemens, who just recently did this report analysis for our Town of Washington Natural Resource Inventory. Michael, I'm not going to say much about you. I'm going to let you just tell us about yourself and then go into your discussion.
Well, basically, I'm a conservation biologist. I've been doing this for probably 40-some years. I spent some time at the CAC Institute. I'm chairman of my own Planning and Zoning Commission, and I do a lot of work with commissions and agencies around the whole nested problem of land use, decision-making, information to make better decisions. So it's very exciting to be able to talk to you about the NRI, because the NRI really is the single most important activity that a conservation commission, whether they're in Connecticut or New York, can do. A lot of conservation commissions, or advisory councils as you call them, fall into the trap of becoming like review agencies, giving comments, and that's important. But the beauty of being on the Conservation Commission is that you can be an unabashed advocate for the environment. You're not charged with the balancing act between property rights and public interests that a planning and zoning board is. So when I first started talking to Margaret, I put together this think piece, or this report, which I believe has been on your website for some time, and hopefully some of you have read it, because the question is, what is an NRI? What can it be? What could it be? And given the focus here in the town of Washington on the climate smart communities, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. As a matter of fact, I'm also advising my own Conservation Commission in my town about how to weave all the issues of resiliency into the NRI. Now, traditionally, the NRI was more like a catalog, maps, narrative description of what was in the town. It was sort of a catalog. And well, that's very important. It's very important to know where the important resources are. It's really just the beginning. Particularly in a place like the town of Washington, you have a very unusual landscape for a couple of reasons. First, you're in a very interesting, what we call, biogeographic position. You're sort of in the Hudson Valley, the Central Valley of the Hudson Valley. And you're really at where many southern species are reaching the northern range limit. So you have a lot of species that you travel 30 miles further north are not there anymore. The other really interesting thing about Washington, and there are very few other towns where I've seen this, one of them actually is Greenwich, Connecticut, is where the traditional pattern of land use has actually protected a lot of ecological integrity. That land use being the large estates, which of course now are all at risk of being cut apart and developed. But that is really what the two important things are: both the position of the town in the Hudson Valley, the pattern of land use, and both of those are central. So I think this is all my opinions, that your NRI can be far more powerful than a catalog. I think you could begin to look at the ecological opportunities that not only afforded to the town of Washington, but regionally, why you're regionally important. For example, species I mentioned, like box turtles, really at the very northern edge of their range in Washington and in the Hudson Valley. And through research, we found that box turtles, for example, at the range limit are very large. You go on Long Island, the box turtles are very small in the pine barrens. But at the range limit, box turtles they've been selected for large body size. It's an ecological trade-off because for a poikilothermic animal, or colloquially cold-blooded, being large carries significant risks. You need more energy to get going. So what is the benefit of being large at the end of your range for a turtle? And that's really resistance to early autumn and late spring frosts. So why this is important? You could argue that towns such as Washington have these species that are best able to actually advance northward with climate change. They have the right genetic adaptations. We talk about conserving biodiversity. It's not a sort of a collection, one of this, one of that. It's about genetic diversity. And I would posit that the genetic diversity of many of your species in the town of Washington make them uniquely suited to be able to respond to climate change. So I think a really important focus, in my opinion, and these are all my opinions, I always tell my clients, I provide advice and guidance. You can follow it, you don't have to follow it, and I give you no guarantees by following it, you're going to get what you want. So these are all suggestions. I do think that peripheral and range-end species should, if I were writing an NRI, be a really important focus. You have a lot of species that are widespread, but what are the species in Washington that are really peripheral and range edge? Because those are particularly important in times of climate change. Washington still remains relatively unfragmented. You go along Route 44, you look across the valley to the Hogback, large tract of land that's just been protected on the Montague property. You really have a sense of what an unfragmented landscape looks like. We talk about biodiversity, we really talk about not tens of acres, but hundreds of acres. Thousands, up to really the critical benchmark for ecological integrity for many species is 1,000 acres of interconnected habitat. That doesn't mean habitat that's devoid of people, but it's just where they're able to still be connected. And you have a lot of that in Washington. You're very blessed with that. But these are at risk, as you know. The other thing is that, and I think I refer you to look at how to create resiliency, is to identify other critical areas on the landscape, choke points, where if developed, could actually severely fragment the habitat. There are certain areas that I believe one needs to identify as being particularly crucial to the ecological fabric. So even putting a small development in a valley which connects two valleys can have effects on the ecosystem many orders of magnitude larger than the development. I'd like to introduce a term that I use, the developed footprint and the ecological footprint. The developed footprint is what you see, the bricks and mortar. The ecological footprint is how far the effects of development are felt into the ecosystem. A good example is a major interstate. You probably can all agree that there's an interstate There's the side of the interstate where the deer all graze, and we think that's the disturbance corridor. But actually, a lot of studies have shown the effects of an interstate, like the Northway, go easily 3/4 to a mile on each side. And part of the idea of really thinking about large scale is the ultimate goal is to get the developed footprint more in balance with the ecological footprint. It's never possible to do it even 100%, but to be cognizant that one development placed in the wrong place can have far-reaching effects. And I believe by understanding where these places are in your town, you're able then to be able to have something to go back to the planning board, the other decision makers, and say, these are particularly important. That you develop in this little pocket, your footprint may be hundreds of orders of magnitude greater. So again, I would think because of the way Washington is at the periphery of the range, and because you have such a rich, interconnected tapestry of habitats, that dispersal and connection corridors really should be another important component. I referred you to look at on my website to the Eastern Westchester Biotic Corridor paper that we did many years ago. We identified 2 or 3 choke points on a tri-town area that, if they were built on, would sever, irreparably harm the landscape. Many of the corridors are quite apparent. Streams, rivers, valleys, those are your very typical dispersal corridors. So we've talked about the anthropogenic uses in the town of Washington. And I think another really important thing to look at in the NRI, again, this is the NRI of the future, not just a list of birds, a list of plants. This is an NRI that will guide you in the future, is to really analyze the changing patterns of land use. A lot of that can be readily obtained through photo imagery, other sources, but it's primarily a rural landscape. And I think it's important to understand that, to understand the importance of open working landscapes and the interplay of the wetlands between them as part of a whole, again, this ecological fabric. So I'm suggesting to you that you take a very, very high level look at the town as it is now, as it once was, and what it could be in the future, both negatively and positively. Clearly, you want to do your bedrock and superficial geology. Those are important maps to have. Many of you probably know that you have a limestone belt in town, which has unique habitats associated with it. It's sort of centered around Mabbittsville, but there is a well-defined marble valley there. Your other geologies, there's a lot of gray rock shale and other types of geology, but the marble valley is extremely important. I think it's also important in a community such as this to map the agricultural soils. Prime, statewide important. I think those are important resources. And if the town is going to try to maintain its rural nature, its agrarian history, I think understanding where those best soils are is important. Habitat types. I think you have the Hudsonia map. It gives you a lot of habitat types. I think that's a very important part. That is a good map. It's not the final word, but it gives you a sense of where things are and where the particularly unusual communities are. You have a very rich diversity of wetlands. You have small but critically important vernal pools. You have, particularly in the Mabbittsville area, calcareous fens. You have marshes and swamps. You have a lot of red maple swamps. Over time, they will, with beaver activity, will cycle out again, become marshes, and then back to forest. Unfortunately, you have a lot of anthropogenic wetlands, reservoirs, ponds. They may look pretty, but their ecological values are relatively low. I know there have been controversies in town about building more ponds and lakes. They're basically not particularly the best biological habitats, though humans like them. They like to see swans and geese and ducks. And when I see an impoundment, I see a lot of species associated with those wetlands that are actually destructive to other wetlands. If I could maybe talk a little bit about that, I look at structural complexity, wetlands that have layers of forest, different canopy closure. Those are structurally complex wetlands. And there has been a pattern in many towns, including Washington, of basically turning complex wetlands into simplified wetlands. When you flood a red maple swamp, a marsh, a vernal pool, you are replacing a structurally diverse, important wetland with one of lesser value. And people say, well, that's all wetlands. It's all the same. Well, it's not. Not all wetlands are equal. And again, understanding where those wetlands are, where the really unusual ones are, and where they may be threatened by various schemes to create more generalized wetlands. Now, in preparation for this analysis, I actually looked at your wetland regulations because I know there's been some concern about how basically certain things could happen or being permitted. And I was surprised to see that actually the town has no prohibitive area around a wetland. There's no real buffer area that's protected. There are basically two concepts in wetland regulation. There's the URA, which was the upland review area, which is the area where a planning board or a wetlands commission can look at impacts on a wetland, but where development can be permitted. And then you have strictly a buffer area, which is not a URA, it's actually an area that's protected to buffer the wetland. Now, in your definition, in your wetlands ordinance, you have the term controlled area. And it actually conflates these two terms. And I think one of the really important outputs might be to sort of straighten that out, because a controlled area is neither a URA or a buffer. It's another animal, so to speak, that really has no basis in science or policy. In times of climate change, we're talking about connectivity. I would suggest you need to identify those riparian corridors and those wetlands that need buffers, that is untouched areas that will protect the wetlands, filter nutrients, and act as wildlife corridors. Right now, as I read your current wetlands regulation, you can develop theoretically anywhere up to the edge of a wetland. I don't believe that was the intent, but that's the de facto result. So your wetlands protection really needs to look at what are the areas that we want to review development in, and what areas bordering wetlands are so important that we don't want any development, limited development. And this is particularly leads me to the next thing that gets in, and this is very much part of being a climate smart community, because we've all been witness to the increasing frequency of rainfall, pluvial events, as we scientists like to call them. They're coming more frequently, more vigorously. We have much more flooding. So our floodplains and floodways are increasingly important. We need to map them and we need to buffer them. And although people still talk about the 100-year flood, increasingly in terms of resiliency planning, the 500-year flood is the standard that's being used in much governmental infrastructure. Oftentimes, the difference between the 501-year, 100-year flood line are almost identical. But where they're not identical are areas that are very important. If you have an area that is where you've got a big gap between the 100 and the 500-year line, that's a very critical area that I would suggest you need to look at closely, because it's an area that's going to flood, and these areas do occur. Much of, I think, what I'm speaking about is, in fact, very relevant to resiliency. Resiliency, as you know, is creating systems that can withstand climate change. We have two types of infrastructure. We have the built infrastructure, and we have the green infrastructure. The green infrastructure provides a lot of ecological services and helps protect the built infrastructure. But if we don't take care of the green infrastructure, we're going to threaten the built infrastructure. And you really do need to know where your green infrastructure is, where the most important parts of the green infrastructure are, and where they're most at risk from current land use patterns or emerging land use patterns. This is how you take a study of the NRI that's really a catalog and make it something that actually can help guide public policy. And I believe that is one of the big things that the Climate Smart program wants to do. Now, there's a lot of discussion always about exotic, invasive, and overabundant species. We tend to conflate those, we map those, and I have abandoned the terms of injurious, exotic, invasive, and overabundant. I have a single word for all those species, and they're subsidized species. And they're subsidized because the subsidies that we as humans have provided. That subsidy can be the way we manage a landscape. It could be introduction, as in the case of many other species and plants. But I think by referring them as subsidized species, we begin to understand why they're here. Many people get very upset about certain species. They're good species, they're bad species. In my view, species are neutral constructs. It's the decisions that we have made in the past and will make in the future that's going to determine how much of a problem these species are. And that gets right back to the idea of creating so many large lakes and ponds. Those are reservoirs of subsidized species. Bullfrogs, snapping turtles, Canada geese, swans. These flourish at the expense of many other species. So I think it's important to address subsidized species, but to put them in proper context. How do we control or limit their ability to impact the environment? And I think there may be certainly parts of the town where there may be some real management required. And again, you can identify that. There are also neglected habitats. The habitats, I know Hudsonia has them on the map and they've written about them. Such things as scarified areas. Those are sandy, dry areas, ex-gravel pits and that. Those are important habitats in their own right. They often support a unique guild of species, but too often they're viewed as wastelands. So I think one needs to take off the attitude that, well, this is a degraded, wasted habitat. And Eric Kiviat sort of was really good at this. He spent a lot of time studying the kind of species, rare species, that exist in these very marginal habitats. And there are many of them. And if we flood these marginal habitats or do other things to them, those species disappear. There's a species, I don't know if it's in the town of Washington, called the sandplangiardia. It's a plant. It's really found only in cemeteries and other dry, sandy areas. So we get to historical features. And that's a really interesting divergent point on the NRI. Some towns put a lot of energy into cataloging the historical features, the buildings, the districts. Others talk about the landscape or features on the landscape, such as stone walls. That's something that's a wide open topic. The only thing I do think is important is to talk about how the landscape has changed and how it continues to change, that historical perspective. Whether you want to look at other types of historical uses, that's an open question. I also think that it's probably valuable at this point to start looking at green energy resources. It may be helpful to understand the number of houses that are using solar energy, geothermal. These are the kind of things that are, again, go right back to the climate smart community. Where are the opportunities for green energy to be put in town? Oftentimes you think about it on private land or houses, but where are there potentially opportunities on municipal buildings, parking lots? Those are important because if we reduce fossil fuel consumption, we reduce a lot of other things. I think I don't need to tell you that. So you may want to think about, and that's just a rough idea in my mind, of some of the things you could think about. Who to partner with. I know when I spoke to Margaret, you talked about having to partner with other communities. Certainly from my perspective, and I've done this when I worked in the town and village of Warwick, it makes a lot of sense to partner with the village. The village is, I think, 1 square mile that sits in the center of the town. And they really are intimately connected ecologically. The village has often been historically the receiving zone for density from the town. So I think partnering with the village is important. You can't do an NRI of a block of land with a mile cut out square in the center where you don't really understand what's going on. Most of your riparian systems go through the village. And certainly also makes sense potentially to partner with other towns. We have shared resources. When I ran the Metropolitan Conservation Alliance, we formed intermunicipal compacts, working groups between towns that was centered around shared resources. We called them biodiversity corridors, but they often involved contiguous towns sharing resources and finding out how together they could designate on a macro scale what you may be doing within Washington. So I've sort of covered in short what I wrote, and I really had hoped tonight would be a chance for you to ask me questions about some of this.
Thank you, Michael. Does anyone have any questions in the?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Perfect, thanks.
Hi, Michael. The NRI to somebody coming new to it seems to be a pretty daunting task, and yet it's very important that the town of Washington get it done as soon as possible. What do you think is the best way to get this done most expeditiously, given your experience in the area?
Well, that's a really great question, and I didn't touch on that. Actually, is to find out what you have. Oh boy, there's an echo now. That's better. Yes, thank you. To really understand, what do you have? What do you have already? What studies have been done? I know when I was at the CARI Institute, we did a vernal pool study. We sort of cataloged all the vernal pools in the town. You've got the Hudsonia map. So the first thing is, what do you have? What sources of information? And then who can help you? You have institutions in your town, such as the CARI Institute, such as the, which I guess is now the Institute for Ecosystem Studies. You have the Cornell Cooperative right next door. You have great resources. You have resources of Dutchess County. So I think the first thing is to sort of get a handle of what you have and who can help you. You may need to hire people to help you. And I'll be very clear, I was very clear with Margaret here. I am not looking to do this. It's not a pitch to hire me to do it. I think there are other people you can get who will do it. I'm happy to advise, but I think you can establish your own team of people to do it. One caveat is when you're hiring consultants to help you, try to hire consultants that have experience in land use planning for conservation. Many consultants are, I think, overly pro-development. They come from firms that do basically only development or development-oriented work. You need to find firms that actually specialize or have a mix of commercial development work and conservation work. You, for example, could speak to people at Scenic Hudson. Although Scenic Hudson doesn't work in your area, they have a lot of knowledge about this. Quickly, that's one thing I don't know. I know there's some pressure to get products, to get grants, and I just don't know what to tell you there, because you could certainly create a blueprint for what you want to do, but the kind of work that needs to be done is probably at least a year or two to get it all together. So how you want to structure that, if you want to hire people to do it, you probably have to put out an RFP, bid it out. It can't happen overnight, but a plan can happen if you're concerned about trying to obtain grant money. I think you could write a robust outline and plan of what you need to do to get to the NRI. But to think that you can create an NRI in a few months is not realistic. Did that respond to your question?
Yes, it helped. One of the things that we'll be struggling with is that who actually will be doing the drafting, who is going to be organizing it, because that will be somebody with experience in this area, because it doesn't seem like people on the CAC may be able to do it on our own, but none of us have the background in this kind of drafting that will be necessary to put together a credible NRI. So,
do any of you have GIS skills? There's that echo again.
Minimal. Minimal.
Minimal. Do you have access through the town? Do you have a GIS person? Do you have access to that?
Well, we do, like Cornell's going to help us with some of this anyway. So we've been in contact with them and still just waiting to see about our grant before we go much further.
The GIS is an incredibly powerful tool, as you know. You develop different layers. Much of what I've been talking about actually is development of layers. Everything I've spoken about can be converted to shape files and put into a GIS layers, which is ultimately the way you can create maps, the way you can analyze, do GIS, gap and spatial analyses. And most commissions don't have that capacity, nor are you expected to. But you should be able to find out who can help you and work with them. As it comes to drafting, a lot of the writing, I have no idea various writing skills, but the NRI that's being done in Salisbury by our Conservation Commission, they've divvied up the responsibilities of different chapters to different people. I don't know if that works. I don't know the individual strengths of people. We have one person that knows land use very well, changing patterns of land use. I have no idea what the sources you have of in-house knowledge. That will depend. That's sort of the next step, the next set of questions you want to ask. The first thing is, what do you want in your NRI? And I've sort of thrown out concepts. Once you sort of winnow that down to what you think you want, then I think it's to try to begin to fill in those gaps. Who do you need? Who will do it pro bono? Who will do it at a reasonable cost? And who will do it well? You want someone who actually will make this NRI really a priority, not one of 100 other things. Because this really, to me, is the foundation of any sound planning for this town going forward. This is the foundation. It's not an accessory. Oh, it's not an amenity. In Connecticut, we have the plan of conservation and development for each town, and integral to that is our NRI. They work one off the other. I don't know how it is in your town, but clearly the NRI should be guiding a lot of things that are happening in the town. I think there are definitely opportunities to improve some of your regulations, but I think you just can't go in and say, gee, I want to have wetland buffers instead of controlled areas. I think it's incumbent upon you all to create the data to make the argument why. I think there's a need. From what I see, there's a need to really think about that. Because right now there are no wetland buffers in the town of Washington. There are these controlled areas, which as a practitioner make no sense to me. They're neither buffer nor are they upland review areas. They're an unusual construct. And I realized when the wetland regulations were put forward, there was a lot of compromises that were made. But it may be good now that you live with those regulations for a while to look at them critically in terms of what are they going to do? How are they going to move us forward into the future? Also have to do with the planning regulations. Are your planning and regulations really encouraging the kind of development you want to see that's going to be compatible with ecological integrity? One of the most difficult things I found is that often the best ecological solutions for development and planning require extra layers of review and bureaucracy. We did regulations in several towns. The default standard often was the one that was most available to a developer. The easiest pathway was often the most destructive. And the conservation alternatives, such as clustering and other types of shared driveways, they were often available with an extra layers of review. So if you want to incentivize people to conserve, you need to look at how the regulations are not accomplishing that, how they're disincentivizing people. Development is going to go, it's like a flood. It's the path of least resistance. If the easiest way to develop is single lot zoning, a couple of acres per lot, that's how it's going to proceed. We've replaced standards in several towns now. In Connecticut, we basically say you have to use cluster zoning, cluster development as the default standard. That is your as of right standard. And if you're not going to use cluster, you're going to have to develop written findings as to why you can't. So you turn the whole sort of fragmentary way we development all around. I don't know if you're ready for that yet, but anything like that, the argument has to be based on data. The NRI are the data to base such arguments.
Michael, I have a question about your NRI in Salisbury. Did you, I imagine you hired consultants, and I'm listening to this conversation. It's wonderful. And and seeing that how overwhelming the project can be for the town. So it usually it costs quite a bit of money, and it requires some decent budget to actually pull one off well, I would assume.
Yes.
Fundraiser, I'm thinking they have to raise quite a bit of money to actually hire some people.
One of the problems we're seeing since COVID has been a lot of the consulting firms are overloaded with work. It's very hard to get people. We've put out RFPs in Salisbury for different types of studies, only to have one or two responses. And oftentimes the response comes back outrageously high, which indicates to me that we really don't want to do this, but if you're willing to pay us $150,000, we're going to do it for a job that really should cost $50,000. We have an ongoing study of downtown Lakeville. It was very difficult to get people to bid on it. There are just not enough consultants out there. The consulting world, many of the smaller firms are being aggregated into larger firms. The larger firms have overhead and high budgets. You're really left with individual practitioners or big firms. The intermediate field is very small. So what does that mean to you? You probably have to identify the individual practitioners that you want to work with and piece that together. I think putting it out to bid to the big firms is going to get you a price tag that often is going to give you sticker shock. That means more work for you. You're going to have to decide the components you want, and you're probably going to have to put together RFPs for each component. Then you may be able to get individual practitioners that are willing to bid on those.
So could you give us examples of the components? So it would be like a geologist and a biologist.
You want to get a geologist, biodiversity specialist. You may need to get someone, wetlands expert, but everyone you get at, you have to really say, we want this not to be a catalog. We want it to take it the next step. An ecological land use planner. There are so many things. There are not many people that do this.
So you have to have the vision. So you have to have a central vision before
Well,
you
the
go.
central vision comes from the people sitting around that table that I'm looking at. You are the vision. You need to find people to make that vision a reality. I'm looking at your faces and I see it's kind of daunting. It's not all that bad. I think once you take it and put it into pieces and ask, first, what do I want? What do we want in our NRI? And how do we get it? What are we going to have to pay for? And what can we get volunteers and help with? I think right now it's like any project. You're looking at this big pile of stuff and it's overwhelming. Once you begin to start figuring it out, then it won't be so overwhelming. But the first thing you have to decide is, what do you want in your NRI?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michael, Howard Schuman, question. We did this a long time ago and not quite as well. It was done through Vassar College. Somebody put everything together, put all the maps together. And I don't know where the data wound up, but it was quite extensive. You had soil, you had rocks, you had everything you mentioned. The problem is the town ignored it entirely. So how do you solve that problem?
When you say the town ignored it entirely, I mean, the geological maps.
Well, it was like a property rights. It was like a taking. We have a lot of pro-property rights people in this town, big estates in some cases, and they don't want too many restrictions. So how do you put this into practice? I'll give you an example. The Johnson estate, which you may be familiar with, it's like 1,000 acres, and it's next to the Bonnecue estate. Both of these have sort of dissolved away, that they were like a major habitat block in the town. And the Johnson has, I think, 9 lots or so that the heirs are taking over. And one of the requests that we made to them is, before you subdivide this, that somebody take a look at what's on there natural resource-wise, so that once you put the parcels together, what's on one parcel doesn't affect what's on the other parcel. You know the big picture first. They don't want to do that. It's just an example. So if you want to preserve that whole block, how do you go about getting the town to do that? To get the data done first. And it's been my personal experience that there's not a lot of emotion on the part of a lot of people in the town to do that.
Well,
Is there a way to codify it that they have to do this?
Well, I think that
Take that into account?
well, for example, under seeker, if you're subdividing a 1,000-acre parcel into 9 lots, that would be a positive seeker declaration, I would think. I mean, doesn't your planning board do pos decks on these things?
Well, suppose you have like a certain type of habitat or a certain type of process that you're trying to preserve, and it covers 2 or 3 lots, and somebody is on one lot and they do a little piece on their own lot, and then somebody on the other lot does a little piece on their own lot, and pretty soon the whole thing is sort of chewed away.
That's fragmentation.
By step by step.
That's death by 1,000 cuts. And I think part of what you need to do in this NRI is identify those big areas that are critical and vulnerable to this sort of death by 1,000 cuts.
Yes, that's the whole point. If they don't do that until after people buy each individual property, as opposed to first setting it up and saying that this is a habitat or this is a resource and it covers several properties, and we need to somehow deal with that before the individual properties are sold to people who start to come in and they do a segmented review, pretty soon there's nothing left.
Well, segmentation is illegal under New York state law. You know that. I'm not an attorney, but I know enough about segmentation. I mean, when you've got a 1,000-acre parcel that's going to be developed, you need to do a seeker analysis. Seeker is probably one of the most powerful tools you have in New York. I wish we had something like that in Connecticut. Seeker is one of the most powerful pro-environmental statutes. It's not used properly, but it's there.
Well, oh, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't seeker only come into play once the parcel is active before the process of planning board or somewhere? And it's only on that one parcel at a time?
No, if you're going to subdivide a 1,000-acre parcel, that's the time the seeker comes in, not piece by piece. It may still come in on a piece, but big parcels, when someone says, Johnson Estate, as you said, we're going to subdivide it into 9 sub-parcels, that's the time to do seeker. Because that's the time you can
So they're not doing that. If I could be wrong, and my memory is not what it used to be, but I believe that the discussion was at the time that we asked to do that, and they said, no, we the planning board don't have the authority to do this. It has to wait until each property is before us.
I don't believe that's correct, Howard. I'm not an attorney, but I don't believe that's correct at all. And that's really where the Conservation Commission should come in, or Advisory Council, because you don't have to say what's good for the Johnson Estate, for the people. What will it take to maintain the integrity of that property? And had they done it, studied it, they may have found there's this unique habitat, and that would have basically affected the way the property is subdivided. Do you have open space requirements in a subdivision? I mean,
yeah, it's a very almost untouched large piece of diverse property.
No, but I'm asking
I
you,
used to walk my dog up
do
the
you
area.
have on a subdivision, do you have a requirement for X amount of space to be set aside as dedicated open space?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I don't hear that well.
Okay,
There are
let me
some
give you an
requirements.
example.
There are some requirements about how much space has to be set aside, yes. And one of the
There
reasons
is.
they're kind of punting on this right now is that there is no plans to do any development on any of these lots. They're
And they can't for 10 years.
for years.
So they're subdividing it for the family. They're only subdividing it from for the family, and they're not allowed to do anything with the subdivided parcels for 10 years. They can build a house on it, but they can't subdivide the subdivisions
Yeah,
for
but
10 years.
if you're taking 1,000 acres and cutting it into 9 pieces, you're already having a potential impact. The goal is to avoid impact. I mean, we
So
should
it's
be
3,
discussing
it's,
specifics.
yeah, it is 1,000 acres, but it's 3 parcels being split into 9. So that's what they're doing
Yeah,
right
I
now.
don't know enough about it, except that I think basically the time to look at this is not when it's split into pieces, but at the beginning.
That's what we tried to do. So what's the recourse?
The recourse, you're asking me questions about your town's politics that I can't begin to answer. You're asking whether seeker was followed or not. I have no idea.
Why?
I have a different question.
Go ahead, Jen.
So one of the things that, I have 2 questions. One is, we've got the Hudsonia map of habitats. We've got some other resources, and we have pulled them together. One thing that's been proposed as a start is just going to places identified in those resources as critical habitat or high priority habitat, and kind of ground truthing what's there. Right? That would be one way to start.
I guess, to see if they're still
But
there.
the things we don't have, right. One of the things we don't necessarily have is that connectivity part. And in looking at other NRIs, as you said, most of them also don't have that. Do you know of good examples that we could look at that do more than name
Yes.
the habitats, map the habitats, and say what's there?
Yeah, I think if you look on my website, some of those biotic corridor reports, we talked about connectivity. We were actually talked about connectivity before it was cool. Yes, it
Right,
talks about
but
how
do
to
you know,
maintain.
like, I'm looking for I understand the science behind it and that there's lots of resources out there at that level, but are templates basically for an NRI that does that? Is there an NRI at the municipal level or the town level that you think is a good example of having done that?
I think the town of Richfield had some of that, didn't it? That NRI they had some of it. I think what's happening is people are realizing very rapidly that we need to do a lot more in the NRIs. So we piece it together. If you look at the biotic corridor studies, there was the lower Wallkill, upper Wallkill, east and Westchester biotic, Hudson to Highlands. Those are all on my old website. Those are all attempts to piece together biotic data, community data, to also look at the types of species, the species that were subsidized versus the rare species. We're learning a lot as we go along. A lot of this you're going to have to create as you go along. Is that helpful? Silence. Stunned? I mean, you probably need someone to give you overall advice, and I'm looking for the job, but you need to have somebody who maybe could advise you and help you through this beyond a single phone call. I mean, maybe Hudsonia can help you. I don't know. Have you reached out to them?
Yes, we've reached out to Hudsonia, Cornell, and Dutchess County as well.
Yeah. I think there are resources there.
Yeah. Sorry, it's this one echoes for some reason.
You get me in stereo.
I think it's maybe because you have the mics close to each other.
The other one's not on. This is the only one on. Yeah, this is it. So, if no other questions, Michael, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And we'll probably have a few follow-up questions, as I mentioned to you earlier, and we'll get to you, and
Sure.
hopefully you'll be able to answer those for us. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Good luck and stay in touch.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So we will continue with our meeting. As he exits, everyone else will stay on if they want to keep up with us. So going to old business, we're going to approve the minutes from November 2nd, 2002. We had 2 date issues where 2020 was misput in. So there's 2 of those, correct? And then 2020, I was like, no, wrong day. So, and then one, I found Elizabeth, the last Elizabeth in the very last, the A is missing from her name. As soon as I printed it out to review, I saw it. So that's it. Can I have a motion to accept the minutes with the changes? Thank you. With the changes. Second? Shannon, all in favor? Aye. Unanimous? So be moved. All right, new business. Howard, can you give us an update on the planning and ZBA, please?
Okay, we can start with the ZBA, I guess. They had an appeal from their lawyer to White Rock Farm area variance relief from the 25% rule. Which brings up the question, if the town tells them this is what you're allowed to do, can they then vary what the town tells them they're allowed to do at their will? Which sort of, in my mind, defeats the purpose of having a code telling them what to do in the first place, if they can simply change it anytime they want to. And so this is a ongoing problem. We had the same thing happen with the Wolf property, Wolf, what's the first other person? Clark, the Wolf Clark property. And the town board discussed this and said this is one of the areas in the code that we'll have to look at because there's some conflicts there and we're not sure this is something we'll have to do in the future, resolve these conflicts. So this is another conflict. If the town, this is the same article, that's the 391 article, set point 7 to be exact, which is when you want use variances. So if it says this is what you're allowed to do up to this point, do they then change the code anytime they want to? What's the point of having the code written? Maybe that has to be clarified at some point in the future. Outside of that, it was a nice project that they wanted, and it was relatively environmentally satisfying. And everything else on, this is the November 15th one, and you have all copies of that. Margaret sent you all the copies of everything. Everything else appeared that they follow the procedures for the environment and so on. So there was, except for that one thing which would concern us in the future when we had other things that we mentioned, and they said, oh, well, even though the code says you can't do it, we're going to change the code, what was written to, which we want to do it. All right, so that was that one. Then we have the planning board meeting that occurred the other night. And the applicants who appeared were pretty conscientious. The first one was the Dutchess Land Conservancy. And the main thing with the Dutchess Land Conservancy, which is on the old Perkins property, was lighting, which is an important part. What were they going to do? And they had a very well done presentation. They wanted a dark sky. They were concerned with the intensities, and they were willing to work on when the lights are turned on and off at night. And it was what you would expect from a land conservancy, that they would do a good job. The problem with some of the town board members, planning board members, didn't like it. They thought the restrictions, that they were restricting themselves too much, which I don't personally understand. If somebody wants to go beyond the limits within the town code, what's to stop them from doing that? Especially if it's environmentally well done, which it was.
How did they think it was restricting?
Because some of the town code, you have to remember the town code has gone through iterations from 1972 on, and there's a lot of things that are left over and not covered. And
But they thought what these people were proposing was too restrictive?
the town, some of the members on the town board, when this was brought up, said, well, why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. This is not a big commercial project, and we're going to do it strictly according to what the town code says. And the DLC, weren't having any problem with doing what they wanted to do. And I don't know, it was all in there. It was all in the site plan that they submitted. So I'm assuming they'll follow the site plan in the end.
Last month we talked about this, but we also brought up the point about the stream that's close to the parking and how it can be an environmental hazard. Did that come up at all?
They're going to, are we on that one, or are we on the high school one?
No, the DLC.
Still on the DLC. I don't remember the stream being an issue. It may be an issue, it may have come up. They said that they will take care of anything that was environmentally unsound. They were very, very receptive. So I don't have an answer to that, to be honest. I don't know if that addressed the stream. It should be in the audio somewhere. That's a good point, because this is one of the things that we
Talked
want
about it
to.
last month.
It's probably, if you want to take the trouble to go through all the papers that they turned in, if you can find it. But it was, dark sky was very good, and shielding and a glare, everything was covered. And the other one was the Upton Lake High School, which is in the northwest corner of the town. And it was very, very similar. They had the same sort of things. They wanted to know what to do for lighting, and they were concerned about, there's a stream there, and it may be in part in the other town, which I think is Stanford, I think is the one involved. There's another town next to it that is going to be involved in this, because the wetlands goes into their town as well.
Yeah.
So there'll be a cooperative procedure. We, the town of Washington, will probably be the lead agency on that. But they were trying to do the right thing as well environmentally. So it wasn't one of these people who are hostile to the environment. They seem to cover all the points. Other stuff doesn't really affect us. One is a lot line change, and one is the one that we measured from the ZBA, which they exceeded what was required from how much variance you could give them. The town said you can only give them 25%. They gave them 28%. And because their lawyer asked for a variance, what was the exact wording that he used? Let me find it. Can't find it at the moment in these notes. He basically asked for an exemption to the 25% rule. And that was part of the application. Give us an exemption to the 25% rule and give us more. And that they did. So now I believe they approved them after that. They've been approved. That's the White Rock Farm is done. The other one on the agenda that you have in your packet was the Reef Camillo Gross lot line change, which you could read that if you'd like, but it was approved. Lot line changes normally are approved very easily, and nothing else for us to be involved with. No, that's it.
Beautiful, thank you.
Could be more detail if you'd like.
No, you did that perfectly.
Beautiful job.
Perfect job. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions, concerns, or comments in the building?
I have one question.
Go ahead.
I didn't understand why Michael Clemens was saying that we don't have any buffer requirements in wetlands.
He's saying that the wording is loose. So we gotta go back and read the controlled area. He says it's not defined, that it's just kind of a loose wording. So we just need to go back and read, because it's part of what we're bringing up with the changing or the wording of the town code. So we'll look at it to make sure that it's worded correctly and can be
Adhered to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's in the town regulation, it has a section defining controlled area. And the feeling was that is not a thing. Like, that's not a definition of an area.
But all the discussions about buffer zones, whenever there's a discussion relating to wetlands.
So what he's saying
Where's that coming from?
is that in our regulations, that the buffer, the 100-foot buffer, you can go right up to that 100-foot buffer, and then that's where you can start building. He's saying that you can have different wording that prevents you from doing it right there at the 100, that it should be, even further away.
Defined.
So it's not defined correctly.
Okay.
That's what I got out of it.
Hearing that.
I think we're just gonna have to go and read a little bit more what our wording is. And that I do know when they kind of did the wetlands law, they were a little bit more loose with the way that they worded it. So that it wasn't as restrictive for land, for people who own the lands.
I might be able to help you with
Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, anybody from the public?
That's me, then I'm it.
You're it.
No, I think I guess there are some definition issues because there wasn't really standard practice definitions that echoes so weird, sorry. So I guess Michael is saying that they aren't the usual best standard practice definitions, and that I understood it as the buffer. I was surprised to see that too, but I think he explained that in that document he did for you guys. I think he actually pointed that. I think there's some language in there where he explained it, but it is kind of an alarm. It's a very important note. It's definitely something worth looking into. I understood it as the way it's written now, that you can build in that buffer. And I think it was what my understanding of the wetland ordinances then is one was drafted and then it was through the town lawyers made a lot more vague and a lot looser. That was the impression that that was the impression of a number of professionals that were looking at it at the time. So that might be an area where it was left a little too vague.
I mean, the thing that he was pointing out is that it's not about the 100 meters. It's that the buffer, when defined in the newer laws, is not a set limit. It is defined by the ecological footprint of the upland. And I'd have to look up the special word, the upland, right. And so
As
100
opposed
meters
to
is not a
actual
magic
100.
number,
It's, yeah.
right?
So the topography is going to.
It's,
influence.
yes, it's based on the topography as much as anything.
Are you talking about the fact that if you have like a steep slope, 100 feet maybe up the slope and then maybe very close to the wetlands still, as opposed to
I mean, that's the idea of the
a
ecological
different
footprint's
geometric
different.
way to get the
That
100
they-
feet
Yep.
done?
And some impoundments, it might not matter if you're 2 feet away, because they're impounded in a way where it's not draining into it.
I think that was covered once. I don't know what the language is anymore.
It's just the difference in language, but yeah, it's. So,
Thank you, Adelaide. Is that it for questions, comments, or concerns? Our next meeting is January 4th in 2023. It's hard to believe it's the end of
yeah.
another year. And I hope everyone has a very good holiday season. Can I have a motion to?
I move.
A second?
Yes. Second.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you.